Floor is now open. There are dozens of issues, I think, that have been raised, and probably some that have not been. So this is now an occasion to get those out on the floor or speak your thoughts on them. Floor is open.
Matt, what about resilience and adaptation? I mean, is that something that state actors or non-state actors in any of these places, from your point of view, are dealing with?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I sort of appreciate Professor Shapiro's comments that when you look at, for example, you look at China,
Yeah.
You have to recognize that China doesn't operate as a uniform actor. So if you live in coastal China, if you live in the best arable lands and the cities of Hanoi and Saigon in Vietnam, you're very, very conscious of the issue of sea level rise, for example, and the consequences of that. India gets 80% of its precipitation in fewer than 4 months. And so, the prospects of adapting to that reality and trying to forecast what climate change will do to agriculture and to water supplies is a huge issue. And so we absolutely see, really ingenious steps to deal with that. But, I also agree. I think one of the themes that comes out on the prescriptive end is all the panelists are saying, we have to do more with energy efficiency. It's the lowest hanging fruit.
Right.
That hasn't changed for the past 20 or 25 years, and it's interesting to from a social sciences perspective, why is it that we not only why is Russia underinvests in upstream natural gas production? Why do they underinvest in energy efficiency? Why are the incentives that Peter Compton begins to address? I know Peter Rutland's interested in this too. Apparently we tend to become preoccupied with this when our risk perception is really spiking. We live in a coastal area that's below sea level, and so forth. So this is problematic about our species.
Right. Just got to make
Yeah.
3 observations on that subject, adding to what Matt is saying. First is that in these countries, their response is to what they perceive as risks without actually measuring climate change. And that can range from wanting to put in flood management facilities to trying to improve their ability to deal with forest fires, which again is something that Russia experienced a couple of summers ago, of the worst forest fires in memory. There were comments that this was a once-in-a-100-year event. We, in fact, went into the government in Russia and told them this is not a once-in-a-100-year event anymore. This is something that, in all probability, you're going to see happening much more frequently, given the impact of climate change. And so they were prepared to start putting some money in to deal with that, not recognizing it as a climate change issue per se, but simply recognizing it as a risk factor. Second, for some of these countries, the post-communist countries in Europe, there is actually a constituency that thinks that climate change is a good thing, because they're going to see longer growing seasons in the agricultural sector. They're going to see somewhat warmer winters.
Right.
They don't necessarily perceive the disadvantages of if the permafrost starts to melt, which is one of the real risks that happens in Russia, where there will be a huge adverse impact on infrastructure, as well as release of methane gas. So there is a bit of a constituency there that is actually almost lobbying to say that, from a comparative advantage, Russia may actually benefit from climate change relative to certain other countries. The third thing to keep in mind, and this also colors the whole debate on climate change, is that a number of the countries that are going to be severely impacted, most of the countries in Africa, countries in South Asia, are turning around saying, hey, hold on just a second. You, the developed countries, caused this problem, and we're the ones who are now suffering from it, so you owe us. And so there's a whole discussion that has started up about essentially the climate change compensation that potentially is required to these countries. Now clearly countries like the United States and Western Europe don't really want to fork over billions of dollars in so-called compensation for something which at the time nobody realized was really going to be an issue. But it is something that further compounds the debate on the whole subject of climate change, and one that I think it's one that one has to keep in the back of one's mind.
I could say a couple of things about climate change in China. The Chinese were late to recognize climate change as an environmental issue. there's much more awareness of big particle pollution and cancer rates. But whether or not they look at climate change as the source of some of the problems, there's acute awareness of the security risk involved with the falling water tables in North China. Highly populated area, and the aquifers are dropping down, partly as a result of glacier issues, but also just overuse. So I think many of you have heard of the South-North Water Transfer Scheme, which is building 3 canals from the very, very wet Yangtze River to the very, very dry Yellow River in the north. Again, kind of building their way out of the problem, like a Three Gorges Dam kind of a notion, a technological optimistic sort of notion. And then the other thing to mention is, of course, that it's always the developing countries that are the worst sufferers from climate change, and the developed countries are going to suffer much less. Certainly people talk about Bangladesh all the time, like a third of the country getting flooded now seasonally, and then the refugees pushing into India, and India building a wall to keep them back. But if you ask the Bangladesh government, are you worried about climate change? They say, no, we're worried about, immediate poverty issues. We're worried about cholera, So I think the adaptation conversation is a luxury in a way. I know I have a student who got a job in South Carolina working on adaptation in the coastal areas, so I think we're starting, as you said, in a piecemeal perhaps fashion. That's a NOAA project to work with communities on climate adaptation.
That sounds similar to what Peter was saying, that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, forest fires may be due to climate change, but that's not how it's perceived. It's just sort of a spot
Yeah.
environmental problem.
In the U.S., it's the insurance industry that is
Insurance,
most,
right.
but they're not adapting. They're just not insuring you anymore.
Right.
So,
Well, that is a form of adaptation. Forcing people not to build. I think in the Russian case, there's one piece of good news, because most of the news you've been hearing is like bad news, I think, which would be population decline, right? So the demographics of the government doesn't like this. The Russian government doesn't see it as good news. They're trying desperately to boost population growth because of this 19th century view that the more people you have, the stronger a power you are. But the reality is that Russia has joined Europe and Japan in seeing flatline or declining natural rate of increase. So in the long term, that's good for reducing carbon emissions. But I think the main barrier, apart from this political psychology that I was talking about earlier, about being an energy superpower, the main barrier domestically has been the continuing state control of the energy sector and their inability to completely liberalize energy prices, specifically electricity, is still selling to domestic consumers at about half the rate in the European Union. And this is even though one of Putin's priorities when he came in 2000 was to liberalize electricity sector. And he kept Anatoly Chubais on as the head of the electricity monopoly, and it took them 8 years to privatize and to break up the electricity monopoly. And the point was that foreign investors would come in and buy regional energy companies and would start investing in more efficient plant, and customers would also become more conscious of the value of electricity. It took them eight years to do that, and at the end of that 8 years, they still hadn't been able to liberalize the domestic prices because of fears of political blowback. And so even though Russia is not a democracy, they do occasionally have elections, and the elite is paranoid about losing them, and they don't want to anger the pensioners by hiking the electricity tariffs. So this is a continuing problem, and now it's 2012. It's like 12 years on, and they still can't bite the bullet of having realistic prices. So that means the whole subsidy chain has to be maintained, so that the Gazprom has to be persuaded to supply gas at or below cost, and even the oil companies, even private oil companies like Lukoil, are forced to sell gasoline at a 30% discount to farmers so they get the spring sowing season going. So that whole Soviet-type mentality of the government has to keep everybody happy because they need fuel. That mentality hasn't been broken, and so you won't get real efficiency and conservation measures adopted until that mindset is broken, and there's really no evidence that it's going to happen.
Oh, yes. Go for it, Scott.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yes, I have just one observation from Ukrainian point of view. I'm former Chernobyl veteran, and I still have connection to Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine. I spend every summer in Ukraine all the time, and we have a very important issue in Kyiv when local businessmen related to government who control property try to hide this information about leakage in Chernobyl and about the real situation with radioactivity in Kyiv and in neighboring area. It's still very dangerous, but because of money issue, and because these guys, actually who are related to Yushchenko administration now, they still connected to new administration, these guys try to hide this information about real radioactivity in Kyiv, because otherwise these high prices for apartments in Kyiv, and this is campaign and real campaign when people from Chernobyl Club and other organizations try to raise this awareness about Chernobyl issues, especially after last year celebration, so to speak. Nobody listened to them, and people actually had been persecuted because of trying to publicize, trying to raise this issue, especially right now when Studio Bezpeki actually trying to suppress all this information with Kyiv radiation. It's a very serious issue.
So if I could say, broadly speaking, this question of information transparency around these accidents, whether they're the benzene spill in the Songhua River or the Japanese government failure to reveal the extent of the Fukushima radiation or the Chernobyl issue. And to that extent, I think that all of these countries are under the same umbrella still, and until we really get some kind of accountability and transparency, we're not going to see any kind of democratic oversight over these energy policy questions.
This gentleman has.
Oh, yeah, I just had a question. Maybe some of this has to do, some of the questions about efficiency and the end user is maybe somehow a legacy of central planning, the way in which, when especially, I don't know if it's the way in China, but in Russia, if it's hot and you're on the 16th floor, you just open up a window, right, in your apartment. And there's no real way to monitor how much heat is coming into your apartment. It just is there magically. And some of it has to do with price, but some of it has to do with you can't really control the heat in your apartment as the end user. And the same thing with water to some degrees. If you go to Russia in August, sometimes the hot water won't be there because it's centralized, the heating of that water. People don't have individual, some people do have individual water heaters, but everything is much more centralized. I don't know if there's been a change in that in terms of how the end user, is that the way it is in China as well, that centralized heating and water?
Well, when I lived in China first from 79 to 81, which is a long time ago, there was a thing where everybody south of the Yangtze relied on coal bricks, and everybody north of the Yangtze had natural gas. And basically, it just turned on and the natural gas went on and went off across the whole country at a certain point. Again, back to, I was kind of kidding when I said China isn't authoritarian enough, but But there's a little truth in that, yeah. I mean, the trouble is, you know, they say if all the power is collected in one person and that person is wrong, as was so often the case under Mao, then you really have a problem. So, in the U.S., at least in our building, we have one of these green LEED certified buildings, and one of the things is that you can really track your energy use all the time, and that's kind of cool. And it was the same thing, I guess, if people have a Prius, they say they really get into seeing exactly how much they're using all the time. So maybe that's one way to encourage people to become more energy aware, as well as making energy more expensive.
There are basically two ways we've seen in Europe that energy efficiency can be promoted. The most common is by creating the appropriate incentives, which usually means, first off, having a tariff structure that reflects the true economic cost of the energy. And what we've seen, you know, with the rapid rise in energy prices over the last few years in Europe, increased energy efficiency investments being made, first by industry, but then by residential owners. It can be facilitated by putting in place vehicles to allow people to access funding. A combination, things like the energy service companies, the ESCOs, are quite popular as a mechanism to support energy efficiency. In fact, you'll see this, you know, where I live in the Washington, D.C. area. Pepco will come around and do an energy audit and prepare, you know, help you with putting in investing in energy efficiency improvements. But the other way it has worked, and the particular case of this is Belarus, is by fiat. Belarus imposed energy efficiency standards on its industry. It was actually successful in reducing energy consumption quite considerably. Now, they haven't gone all the way through in terms of what can be done at the individual level, but their imposition of energy efficiency standards and their mandate to industry that they had to comply with these standards has had quite a significant effect over the last several years. Now, the World Bank has been promoting some loans to try and promote energy efficiency, including, as it happens, a loan we put through in Ukraine fairly recently with the Ukr-Exim Bank, which allows the bank to find energy efficiency projects and then provide the funding at a relatively low cost of financing, which makes it more attractive than would be the case if it were being financed directly by the commercial banks.
In Russia, they do have electricity meters now for every apartment, so the electricity is market rationed. But the district heating systems with the heat, which I think originally the environmentalists thought they were good, right? Because they were a kind of efficient way to produce heat from a local power plant. So, you know, in theory, it's a good idea, but not if people are opening windows to reduce the temperature. But efforts to try to privatize those district heating systems and then give an incentive structure for the new owners to improve efficiency, they've all failed. I mean, this was another one of the things that Chubais was trying to do, and they managed to succeed with corporatizing the electricity industry, but the district heating, housing utilities are still controlled by municipalities, run at a loss, depend on subsidies.
But just to add to that, interestingly, one of the countries which has done quite a lot of good things on the energy efficiency side with heating is Armenia. And Armenia did it because their district heating system collapsed so entirely that it had to be completely replaced. And then it was replaced with a distributed heating system, so individual apartments had their own boilers rather than having a centralized system providing heat. And they've actually got much better energy efficiency as a result of that.
There were a lot more hands before.
It's a general question. I think to start with Shapiro's offhanded jokes or whatever comments about China not being authoritarian now, but now free now. The question really is about the role of government in energy consumption, conservation, climate change, and so forth. Can you make a case, since we are talking about not just one country, but multiple countries, Japan and so forth, regardless of the political system, none of them actually is pure communism or pure market economy. Would it be better for the government to take a strong lead in this kind of dealing with this issue, or have market or market stimulating policies play a role in saving energy, in dealing with climate change and so forth? What is your take on that?
Matt, do you have any? Use this
Well,
one
I
first.
think, I mean, it flows from the remarks that were actually just made. I mean, you described some government-led, state-led efforts, for example, in Armenia, and those indicators are impressive. I mean, with respect to the question you asked previously about energy efficiency, and if you look at the U.S. approach, ours has been largely a voluntary environmental management scheme with LEED certification standards driving that. You can opt in or opt out. It would take, in many cases at the local level, just a very straightforward switch from taking the LEED standards and then formalizing those by the state actors and for the building codes. We haven't done that. But there are trade-offs. So it really very much depends upon what are you trying to do, what sector. I mean, if you talk to folks here at Indiana University about prospects of centralized heating and doing a better job with our steam tunnels, they're a nightmare. We see steam pouring out of our sidewalks and.
Yeah, we have a Soviet system here, right, in Bloomington?
And those are dollars just pouring out into the
Very
air.
quaint.
So, I mean, but those are decisions that Indiana University has to make. We're not going to get any help from the state. And, you know, it's a question of making the hard, the difficult upfront investments to do it and doing the cost-benefit analysis. So it really depends upon context, who has authority, what's the environmental medium, what we're talking about.
Well, there's actually three ways the state can help, and in fact I think that the answer has to be a combination of the two, that you aren't going to get the optimum results if you don't have the appropriate incentives that are market-based. You need to have things like the right tariff structure. But the three ways that the state can intervene: the state can simply impose regulations. That's the Belarus example, what they have done. Second, the state can provide subsidies or credits to create an incentive. That's happened a little bit in the United States, it happens a certain amount in Europe. The third is the state can use the fiscal system. And this is very much what has happened in Europe with the excise taxes on petroleum fuels, which has been a significant factor in creating a much less energy intensive economy throughout most of Western Europe. Now, just to cite an example which is not strictly speaking energy efficiency, when unleaded gasoline was being introduced in the UK, it was actually being sold at a price lower than leaded gasoline to create an incentive for people to switch as quickly as possible to unleaded, even though the cost of producing unleaded gasoline was quite a bit higher. And this was simply a case of the state reducing the excise tax on unleaded gasoline so that they would create this kind of an incentive. But it's up to individual governments to try and find what balance of incentives works. My own view is that the United States, if it's really going to try and improve its overall energy balance, reduce its dependence on imported energy, has to do something fairly drastic to reduce energy consumption. The simple solution is ratchet up the excise tax on gasoline and other petroleum fuel usage. But that's unfortunately political death. We were talking about that last night. It's political death to any politician who wants to propose that. But it would have, at relatively low economic cost, an enormous favorable impact on energy consumption in this country.
And Peter, let me suggest that there may be even a fourth way that the government plays a role, or in terms of options, and that's its own market-oriented power.
Right.
And so the government then imposes on itself, in order to create a market, incentives to promote a particular type of energy efficient good or good environmental behavior. So when California says that in year 2020, X percent of our state-owned automobile fleet must be electric vehicles and so forth, that would be an example.
An interesting example of that, indirectly, Costa Rica has mandated that all your energy bills, your electricity bill, when you go and fill up with gas, the receipt tells you how much carbon emission you're now responsible for as a result of that. So at the individual level, everybody in Costa Rica knows just how much of the carbon dioxide emissions they are responsible for. They know what their footprint is.
And let me just say one thing about the China case. It's a very complicated question, I think, as you know. But the market reforms went much faster than the political reforms. And so what we see now is that many of these big commodities are still this sort of half private and half government And there's a lot of corruption involved in the control of these big oil and gas commodities. Sounds like what you've all described in terms of for Russia. In China, we talk about princelings, wangzi, which is the sons and daughters of the high-ranking party leaders who have access to these big commodities and can buy and sell them, even though they're supposed to be government-controlled. So, you know, I always tell myself, you wouldn't want to be a Chinese policymaker, but certainly we need a lot more political reform, a lot more true civil society involvement. So.
To jump in there, in terms of the Soviet heating system here at IU, I fully participate in the window opening scheme because here in Goodbody Hall, it's a way to cool off in January, cool off the building and live in it. But the question mentioned Japan as a perhaps relevant case here, given that maybe it's not the most free market sort of capitalist system. And I would just say, based on my own research on Tokyo's city environmental policy, which is the leading indicator in Japan, the city government policy for the rest of the nation. There they've just begun instituting a trading scheme for CO2, and it's going to be sort of rolled out over the course of the next few years in other large cities around the country. But largely in Japan as well as the second of the approaches the government might take that Peter mentioned, this kind of guidelines and indicative sort of approaches. For building, we mentioned LEED here a few times. Tokyo has developed its own guidelines. And they're not requirements, they're not in the building codes. But you can get certification if a building meets certain kinds of protocols or meets certain kinds of baseline measures. So in Japan, it's again, sort of like you were talking about, Matt, about China and some of these other places in regard to the overall mix, sort of a lot like the US. Not a strong government in terms of demands or requirements. But incentivizing of things like solar cell technology was something that was done in Japan quite early with tax incentives to create a market. And I tend to agree that that's something the United States government, certain administrations have spoken about it, but it becomes very difficult to do politically. But it seems to me that largely the cost would be relatively small. Now you have a problem where the Obama administration tried to do that with the solar cell industry with one big loan and it goes bad, and now it's going to be a completely political third rail for the next decade and a half. And maybe one of the things Obama's hit over the head with come summer and fall. What was it, Solyndra, or what was the name of it? Yeah. Yes, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I have a question about this energy conservation model which came from the United States, which is object of criticism in Europe and in Eastern Europe especially. I just came back a few days ago from the University of Toronto. I had a conversation with my friends, British, Canadian, and the Russian friends, and I told them that they go for this roundtable. They were surprised. What Americans can tell us how to make this conservation, they need to start with this system of cult of automobile, of cars. They need to replace this cult of cars with public transportation. So how they could serve as a model for other parts of the world if they show in their consumption of fossil energy a very bad example. So my question is, how American wasting of fossil fuel for automobile industry, which is cut here, is affecting all these issues about energy conservation in other parts of the world? To everybody in this market.
I should add something very, the idea that automobiles are somehow the biggest polluter here may be a bit suspect. Some of the latest data from the UN suggests that it's actually agriculture. So.
And the other thing I would say is that having a roundtable like this does not mean that we are representing the United States of America.
I think that what's coming out from some of the discussion here is the challenges that are faced here in the United States, where there are solutions that have been introduced elsewhere, such as taxation solutions in Europe, imposition of tighter regulations related to particularly automobiles, much greater use of public transportation. All of these are very positive, but there is a political imperative in the United States which has yet to address that. And again, coming back to the post-communist countries, what we found in a number of those countries is it takes a crisis before they actually start to act and make a dramatic change. In Georgia, for example, and I mentioned this yesterday in another conversation, in the late 1990s, they got down to the point where there was only electricity in Tbilisi about 4 hours a day, and even less in the outlying areas. And people were really starting to agitate. And only at that point did Shevardnadze turn around and say, oh, we've got to do something about this. And that was when they started the privatization process, when they brought in AES to take over the Talassi Distribution Company and the Gardabani power plant. But it took that kind of a crisis for that to happen. It actually didn't fully get resolved until after the Rose Revolution and quite a while after Saakashvili's government took over. But they are in a situation now in Georgia where pretty much everybody who pays for it gets electricity 24/7 on an ongoing basis. And it's a pretty huge change that they've made over a period of about 15 years.
That's got the same thing as true of Japan, right? The OPEC oil shocks really inspired that country to eventually become maybe the most energy efficient country in the world. I think it's just the nature of our species, I'm afraid.
Yes.
But we're capable of changing.
Yeah, but when you have climate events that are only inexactly attributable to climate change, I mean, let's take Katrina. I mean, it appears in Gore's movie. Is it that we can say that's because of climate? Of course, we don't know on an individual basis.
Yeah.
I mean, in one sense, the weather is your climate, but in another sense, any one weather event could have happened in any probably climatic context. So that, you know, perhaps the United States will be the last one to the table in this regard. But it seems that there have been emergencies. I mean, the destruction of a major American city would strike me as a fairly major crisis moment, and yet very little has moved in the American political calculus so far. And you know, we've been talking about it since, I don't know, let's say since Carter. It's been quite a number of decades. So, but I agree. I mean, climate change is already happening. We're now experiencing it. So the only question is resilience and adaptation. My hope would be that all these countries, and certainly the United States, Japan as well, gets more proactive on that score.
I think you're right. However, the dark side of resilience and adaptation is a white-bearded man behind it, Charles Darwin, who will tell you that not everyone is going to be fit. Not everyone is going to be resilient. And that's what's really kind of upsetting here.
Yeah.
So,
And back to the automobile thing, you've heard it said that, talked about the American love affair with the automobile, you know. So I take my students to different organizations in Washington, D.C., and a couple days ago we went to a place called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We would like to visit the enemy, you know, too. And so this one guy is in charge of their automobile disinformation campaign. And what he did was, you know, some years ago there was something, what would Jesus drive? And his answer was, Jesus would drive, you know, with Mary and Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus in the back would drive the biggest Hummer he could possibly buy. It's a tough sell, that one.
But I think that it is it's not just the greenhouse gas emissions, it's also the local pollution, right? And the externalities of traffic jams and so on. And we do see that the arrival of freedom and democracy in Russia and these other countries in East Europe, and to some extent in China, did mean that the right of an individual to buy an automobile and to live in the suburbs. So it is the triumph of individualism, really. And then the downside of that is also individuals will fend for themselves, and some will be resilient and some won't. And I think that's the world that we're living in, and with globalization, it's that's the world that everybody's living in, kind of thing.
But you mentioned the externalities of a traffic jam, and I'm wondering, more as a question, of course it's political suicide just to say that the government should somehow regulate energy efficiency. but is that not exactly what the government is doing on the opposite scale, on the reverse scale, by labeling things as externalities? We don't put an economic value on them, and so therefore it's hands off, but in fact it's hands on by taking our hands off. So could you not make a case that by not getting involved, you are being involved because you're labeling all kinds of things? I mean, chemical inputs in agriculture are externalities. They don't count for the fact that, you know.
I think that's definitely a valid argument that can be made. But I also think back to one of the most libertarian viewed individuals I've met, Kaha Bendukidze, who was brought into Georgia as economy minister, went through a number of different positions. His view was that everything is for sale except our dignity, number one. Number two, he actually promoted the idea of selling water rights. And the idea here was that they'd go to the highest bidder. The highest bidder could use the water rights for whatever he wanted. Industrial usage, if that meant there was no water for agriculture, no drinking water, too bad. People had to go find their drinking water somewhere else. Fortunately, that one got quashed because there are certain public goods that I don't think can be transferred effectively to population. But yes, there is a certain view that goes along those lines, and I mean that's an extreme case. But I think that similar views get shown in the area of energy resources and energy management.
There are a few things out there I just would like more information on. I live in a small, live and work in a small town, so I'm not always connected with what's going on in the world. But what about, I know the Europeans, at least some German firms anyway, are interested in a project in the Sahara to generate tons of solar energy. Is anything going on with that? I was also wondering about is there any realistic possibility of those canals being built from South to North China? And I'd just love to hear comments on this.
Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, there is a major project in North Africa for solar development. The World Bank's been financing a portion of that. But I think we have to be realistic about what's going to happen with some of these renewable sources of energy. I commented about the critical baseload that you have to have in order to have integrity in the system. Photovoltaic technology is still expensive. You can have a project like this which is effectively being subsidized, but even if you end up with, I think this is a 1,000 megawatt project, so it's a pretty sizable project that we're looking at, that's still a drop in the bucket relative to the total amount of energy that we're really going to be looking at. I think that one can hopefully see solar coming in and making a meaningful contribution. But if it ever I'd be very surprised if it ever gets more than about 5% of the total energy equation. But 5% is still a significant contribution.
For the south-north water transfer, there's 3 routes, and the easternmost route has actually already been done, but it hasn't been successful. They basically reopened a route from the Song Dynasty called the Grand Canal.
They've been building canals for centuries.
But it was so full of garbage and chemicals. By the time the water got north, people didn't want it. So that's the first one. Then the middle one is under construction. It involves some human rights violations in that farmers who used to be able to count on those sources of water are no longer getting access to the water. And there's a certain amount of relocation involved with it. It hasn't gotten the publicity that the Three Gorges Dam did, but it's a major engineering project, and that is going forward. The one that really has environmentalists worried, but perhaps it's so difficult that it's not going to happen, is at the very headwaters of some of these major rivers, which would, mess up the Tibetan Plateau. But it's such a major engineering feat that involves such high mountains and all of that there's reasonable confidence that it won't actually happen.
I had a few other questions that maybe I'll just throw out there from my original take of the on the responses and the presenters' write-ups. I guess two of them here, if I can lump them together, relate to larger international context. And one relates to the United States specifically. There just was a report in the New York Times within the last, 10 days, 2 weeks, about a surprising but significant increase in U.S. energy independence. And this relates to, in its own way, Matt's discussion of fracking and new approaches to extracting natural gas. But I wonder about the way in which increasing levels of U.S. energy production might play a part or figure into the energy. I mean, for Russia, probably this is, as a major energy producer of their own, not an issue. But for China, the whole question of the pipeline down from Canada and whether those sources are going to go to the U.S. or China, how does U.S. energy production and the increase of it recently figure into East Asian post-communist approaches to energy acquisition? And then secondly, I think Africa came up very briefly, perhaps in Peter's comments, but we certainly hear a lot in recent years about Chinese assertive, if not aggressive, approaches to natural resource acquisition in the African continent. I wonder if Judith might have something to say about that, but I'm particularly interested. This is one of these sort of dumb questions. I don't know anything about it, but what is the continuing or expanded involvement, perhaps, of the former East European or Russia, I guess, Russia in Africa? Is there an issue there? Is there potential competition between Russia and Chinese for technology transfer or materials acquisition in Africa? Those are two other thoughts I had, and maybe they would be things people could respond to.
Yeah, I think it's not just Africa, Latin America too. China is really active, Ecuador. Costa Rica came up recently. You know, there's different views of China's role overseas. I have a colleague named Deborah Browdigam who's written a rather rosy portrait, actually, of Chinese aid in Africa and elsewhere. But if you really push her on environmental issues, she acknowledges it's not so good. I tend to be cynical, I guess, and my view is that a lot of this aid and direct purchase is intended to facilitate the extraction of resources, whether it's to, build a road, but where does that road go? It goes right into the timber area or the coal mining area or whatever. There's tremendous anxiety, not only in developing countries, but Australia is completely freaked out, to use a scholarly term, about Chinese investment. There's a mountain, I forget the name of it offhand, Whaleback Mountain. We used to see pictures of it originally. It was a great big high mountain. Now it's a great big deep pit, just about the same size. And so Chinese investment, it's a double-edged sword. The Australians are grateful to have all this Chinese investment and activity. They need it, but there is also a fear that China's basically buying up Australia. With Costa Rica, I just have to tell this story. When Costa Rica changed its recognition from Taiwan to the mainland, China gave them a big stadium as a gift. And the Chinese tend to be a little bit, let's say, culturally inexperienced or insensitive or whatever. They basically flew in thousands and thousands of workers, kept them apart from the Costa Ricans. The Costa Rican government had no way of knowing whether they were being paid a fair wage or not, and didn't hire any local Costa Rican workers. And then they built this stadium, and then everybody flew away, and there was this stadium in its wake. And you get a lot of interesting sort of, in Africa, there's a lot of anecdotal, in Nigeria, you hear anecdotal stories about cultural conflicts, where basically the Chinese don't very well know how to deal with local tradition. I always find that very interesting because I'm interested in the cross-cultural side of things.
Yeah.
Well, on the question of the U.S. energy front, as I mentioned, I think it is having an impact. It's weakening demand for Russian gas in Europe, and that coincides with already the shift towards Asian as a future main customer. So, with the the building of the East Siberian Pacific Ocean pipeline, which was possible thanks to a $25 billion loan from China, that opened in January 2011, and that's already operational as far as Daqing, and the extension down to the port of Nahodka is being built. So in future, we'll see that the share of Asia in Russian energy exports will go up from 15% to a third or more. And at the same time, the new fields they're developing in East Siberia are also located closer to the Asian markets. So I think the shift in the U.S. position is reinforcing that reorientation of Russia towards Asia, something that Russia, I don't think, has thought through the political implications of, because Russia has enough problems, managing its relations with Europe, but at least they've got decades of experience in handling that. Whereas the relations with China are so dynamic, I don't think the Russian elite has really figured out. Of course, they're strategic partners and have a lovely relationship. But when it comes down to the bargaining over the price and the details, it got pretty nasty pretty quickly.
Yeah.
On Africa, these Russian energy companies are very aggressive in trying to develop downstream acquisitions. Right now, they're buying up oil refineries in Europe because of the insolvency of many of the European refineries. And in Africa, they're trying to get into the oil and gas, but not with much success. I think they've been more active in the telecom and banking in places like Angola. The Russian companies are getting into those markets because they're certainly not constrained by Foreign Corrupt Practices Act type limits on how to do business in those places.
I think just to expand a little bit on the logistics around the gas sector, oil is a globally traded commodity. Gas is not really a globally traded commodity, it's a regionally traded commodity. Where you get the global trade coming in is with LNG, and what happened with the shale gas revolution and the increased availability of domestic gas was the US cut back on its imports of LNG, which pushed that in the direction of other markets, including Europe. Couple that with the sharp drop-off in demand in Europe that followed the financial crisis in 2008, you see reductions in demand, hence the additional availability of gas that can be moved in a different direction. The big change that could occur is if the US were to change its policy allowing, or currently disallowing, exports of oil and gas. If the US went to allow exports of gas, then I think you would see a fairly significant move to investment in LNG facilities in the US with the idea of gasification facilities, with the idea of pushing gas into the European market, because there is still a huge price differential. I mean, a lot of that is tied into the fact that Gazprom's prices are formulaic prices linked into oil, but even the spot market prices are very, very different between the US and Europe, and the US producers would like the opportunity to access that market. Absent something like that happening, I think we're going to see a drop-off in the investment in unconventional gas over the next few years. It'll take time, but there will be some stabilization in the supply-demand balance. But if there is some policy changes that will allow for a broader level of movement globally of natural gas, then I think you'll see continuing investment in the US.
I had a question. Is there any more foreign companies involved in the Russian energy sector? I mean, I know that they were pretty aggressive in the 90s being involved, but has the deprivatization process been so strong that there's essentially no one left from foreign energy companies?
You've got 3 production sharing agreements that are in place, Sakhalin 1 and 2 and Karyaga, which have foreign investment involved. The big foreign investment engagement is BP with the TNK BP involvement. The one recent announcement was the joint venture between ExxonMobil and Rosneft to go and explore and develop oil and gas in the Arctic. The key there is that our sense, certainly from the World Bank side, is that we don't see much appetite on either side for regular investment. Too many people have been burnt too badly on regular investment in the oil and gas sectors in Russia. But the area where there is potential is areas which are technologically very difficult and where substantial funding is needed, hence the Arctic. The Russian companies simply don't have the technical expertise. Rosneft doesn't have the technical expertise to exploit that effectively by itself, or the financing.
Was there, someone made a reference to offshore gas drilling by the Russians. Would that be in the Arctic Ocean as the ice cap recedes? Are they pursuing that as aggressively as is sometimes indicated?
Well, they've been doing it in the Far East, in the Sea of Okhotsk and around Sakhalin, and they are doing it in the Arctic. But I would say they're not pursuing it as aggressively as some outside advisors have encouraged them to do. So they've been slower in the main Stockman field. That's been on the drawing board for more than 10 years, and they still haven't moved forward with it. But in the other fields, they are doing exploratory drilling.
And by the way, the Chinese are trying to get in the Arctic, even though they don't have much of a claim.
So how are they doing
Yeah, by
that?
what route?
They have these exploratory ships and, you know, the icebreakers. I was in Norway recently, and the Norwegians are all like, oh, our big friends, the Russians, we're going to be so harmonious about all this. And then the Chinese are coming in, too. I don't know what the legal basis is, but they want to be ready, at least to deal.
This is actually another theme that comes out of your response with respect to further south, places like the Spratly Islands and blue water drilling for natural gas and oil, and how that plays out in geopolitics. It's a very important issue, and it's a potential flashpoint going forward. And in some ways, there's nothing new under the sun, because there's always been tension with respect to that. And China's claims, I mean, when you look at the continental shelf delimitation, Chinese claims are always, well, rather substantial. I mean, they claim the entire Yellow Sea as a natural extension of Chinese territory, so which is.
But what's really interesting about those claims is, you know, they go back to, they use the history books. They go, oh, look, in the 13th century, we were here, you know, look at this book, you know. And yet, I think, you know, like it could be a little rock, and sometimes when the tide is high, the rock is underwater, and, you know, the Japanese come in one day, well, not for South China Sea, but, you know, there's disputed islands in the north as well. There's so many islands disputed. Russia and Japan and Korea and China and Korea, but this map of the South China Sea is fascinating, because if you look at the claims, they're all overlapping, and even Brunei has claims in the South China Sea. I mean, Brunei, you know, Malaysia, and so these, when you try to draw a line around, like with the special economic zones, the exclusive economic zones, sorry, of 200 miles around these islands, it's almost impossible to avoid tremendous overlap. But the Chinese are definitely saying it's ours, sorry. And the Chinese are way stronger than everybody else who has a claim. And so that brings in America. And recently Hillary Clinton was in there, oh, well, we're going to defend the Philippines' claim. And then the Chinese get all huffy. And now the Americans are getting really expanding our naval presence in Australia. So there's some serious conflicts around this. And I'd say, yes, it goes back forever, but the technologies don't go back forever. It's not just about oil and natural gas and maybe technologies that allow pulling up out of the deep seabed, but there's also the collapse of the fisheries worldwide, and so all this interest in controlling fisheries. And then there's shipping lanes, too, that are at stake here. So there's a lot involved in the South China Sea.
Peter Thompson at the end gave us a quote about wars of the future possibly being about water. And one of the follow-up questions I had initially listed for myself went on in that same vein. Although my question was going to be, we've long heard about wars of the future being about water potentially, but what about wars of the future being about oil? And it's sort of, I mean, you talked about flashpoints. Of course, as we certainly know from the 20th century, much international conflict was arguably and sometimes expressly so driven by oil, certainly in East Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of Japanese history. But what about the potential for actual open, hot conflict over these kinds of questions? I mean, I suppose you just sort of spoke to that, Judith, but it strikes me that water is one issue, but oil certainly isn't going to go away in the 20th century, or gas.
Well, I think we see a lot of instances. Again, it's a little bit at the margin,
Yeah.
But there's been at least one concession block in the South Caspian, which was awarded, and Iranian gunboats came out and basically shooed off the company that was planning to do the initial seismic work. We have the case of the Falkland Islands in Argentina and Britain
Re-emerging.
and the emerging issues there. Of course, back in 1983, that didn't relate to oil and gas. Now it's sort of re-emerging because there is some believed to be some prospectivity on the oil and gas side. So I think anywhere you have potentially disputed waters and there are some subsoil prospects for oil and gas, you're going to get the potential for conflict.
And as Peter said earlier, the water energy nexus is more and more a focus of attention from scholars and policymakers, and I think right now we don't pay so much attention. This wars against, I think I'm getting tired. The wars over water question. There's also that whole counter argument that, in fact, water has more often than not been something that countries can get along over. People often point, for example, to India-Pakistan and the Indus River Treaty, where you think India-Pakistan are traditional enemies, but at least on this question they've been able to cooperate. So I think that this, at least in terms of scholarly history, I think it was Boutros Ghali made that the next war is going to be fought over water. Maybe Ismail Sergel may have repeated that, because I've seen so many graduate papers that start the next war is going to be over water, and they all like, no, it's not exactly. And so environmental peacemaking is often around water as well, or people like to look at the difference between states that lie along a river and the unequal power balance as compared with lakes that surround countries that surround a lake, where there's more of an equitable sharing opportunity, and so on and so forth. But I think it's coming back, this wars over water assertion. And there's a new book that I have by a guy named Brahma Chelani called Asia's Water Wars, something like that. It's just out this year. It's a little sensationalistic, but he presents the Indian point of view, and these guys are frantically afraid of China because of China's control over the upstream of all their key rivers. So we'll see.
But in the past, were any wars actually fought over water in the past?
Well, in environmental studies, we always like to say, people always say that people are fighting over resources, but the only real war over resources was the Cod War between Iceland and England, and it lasted 2 weeks, and it was centuries ago,
1972.
So then you do this whole study of the indirect ways in which competition over resources, whether it's resource abundance or resources curse, whether those contribute to different kinds of conflict. And you also look not only at interstate conflict, but intrastate conflict and the tensions that arise over resources there. My contention is that most of these wars are over resources one way or another, and it may be that it appears that they're over ideology or ethnicity, but in fact ideology and ethnicities also form around control over resources. So when you go deep into it, it's, I'm a hunter, I'm a gatherer, I'm a farmer. Your cultural identity is very bound up in your geography and resources that you control. So, but there's debate over all this.
I just want to add there that the potential for conflict isn't just interstate, but can be intrastate as well.
That's what I just said.
I taught for a brief time at the University of Alabama, and there was potential for a sort of intra-southern states civil war over the river systems down there in the first part of this decade. Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee in particular. I'm not an expert on those river systems, but there was a lot of great controversy among those states.
This wonderful book about the settling of the American West, Cadillac Desert, about the water wars of the American West.
I was just going to say that the dispute over the Jordan River waters in the 60s was a big factor in the outbreak of the 67 war between the Arabs and Israelis.
I was going to add, I think we're limiting ourselves if we're thinking of only international wars. I'm from Pennsylvania, and that's where most of this fracking is going on for shale gas, and I'm very connected with the agriculture industry there. And there's a huge tension because it takes an incredible amount of water to extract this gas. So they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, and there's a huge tension. Of course, it's not necessarily going to arms because, we think we've moved beyond that, but have we? there's a huge tension between all of the agricultural community and the access to water. That's
And the people who
so-
use those watersheds who are afraid that their watersheds are getting polluted by these
And they are.
fracking chemicals. So,
It's not even
yeah, I mean, you look at communities and, you know, there's no fracking here, yes fracking here, no fracking here.
So I
And,
think
you know, communities are really divided over
interstate
this
potential
issue,
is
yeah.
perhaps even greater.
Mhm.
Well, there's fracking in Oklahoma too, and there were some earthquakes there in places that never had earthquakes before, and there was some, you know, as in the case of China, there's this connection between energy projects and possible earthquake incidents.
Mhm.
In the back.
I was just wondering, within the United States, kind of bringing together water and climate change, a lot of what enabled the population shift to the south was the kind of ameliorating effect of air conditioning, but that also consumes fuel. And so maybe in the far future, as we see a decline in available resources and kind of a shift in priorities and how we use them, I'm curious as to how the regions like that, whereas the South, in Atlanta, in Georgia or South Carolina, or maybe Texas, they're more prone to drought, or out west with management of river water resources. I am completely ignorant if there's any kind of long-term planning going on with these potential issues, or if we are just kind of hoping natural forces, whether it be more market forces, or we will regulate that as we get to it, or something in between. Is there a viable discussion going on to kind of address these long-term issues? I know the only thing I've heard about is maybe shifting, kind of like a China strategy, shifting water resources from the Great Lakes region south, but.
Well, even Indianapolis wanted Monroe County's water down here about, what was that, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago? And Monroe County said, no, we built the reservoir 45 years ago, and it's our water. So, I mean, it can be a very local issue. I don't know, Matt, do you have any thoughts about that
Well, I
in
think
an
it
American
comes back
national
to this
context?
question. I think it's a sort of a sobering, grim consensus that we tend to respond to crises.
Right.
Macon, Georgia, a couple of years ago, when they had a nasty drought, imposed what many communities do, which is a water watch. And if you were watering your lawn, you might have a citation imposed. But I don't think Macon has developed a long-term strategy to deal with this in the future, and they undoubtedly will need to do that, or they're going to face more of these, crises, because the projection for 100+ degree days in places like Atlanta and Macon, and not to mention places in the Southwest that are dependent on the Colorado River water, is really pretty sobering. So unfortunately, we don't do a whole lot of long-term planning, including in places that are not very well watered, that are west of the Mississippi. So.
One of the principles of international environmental law is the principle of equitable use. But that said, one of the earliest treaties was, I think, called the Harmon River Treaty between the U.S. and Mexico, and we were supposed to guarantee Mexico enough water, and we didn't.
But in the case of the West, a lot of the treaties are governed by another principle, which is prior appropriation. We developed it first, so tough luck for you. So this is probably not sustainable in an era of climate change.
I think part of the problem here is that despite the investor axiom of past performance is no predictor of future results, in fact, when we come to looking at climate issues, people tend to look at the past and they say, we have historically here a 100-year event in terms of heat, or a 100-year event in terms of the hurricane season. But the reality of climate change is that the weather patterns are becoming increasingly volatile. We don't know how volatile they're going to be. We don't know which way they're going to go. We can look, for example, at the current situation where this has been one of the earliest springs across a lot of the country that anybody can remember. That doesn't mean we're going to have an incredibly hot summer. We could conceivably have a very cold summer. It's just that the volatility patterns don't let us predict. And I think it makes it very difficult for someone to say with any certainty that we are going to have, with hard empirical evidence, that we are going to have this kind of drought condition in Macon, Georgia in the future, and therefore we need to take action to deal with it. But the practical reality is that these kinds of events are going to become more frequent, whether it becomes a once in 10-year event as opposed to a once in 100 or a once in 3-year event. At this stage, we don't know. And that's where I think the crisis aspect comes in, that after the third straight year of water shortages, people will start to react and do something, but they may not do it based on past history.
Maybe I'll take a skeptical note on that, because again, I keep going back to this. Agriculture is the single biggest user of water, especially in the Midwest. And I have extensive ties with the network, and most of the people say it's temporary, right? It's going to pass. So yeah, we've had 3 years of drought, but historically, it gets better.
So it has to be 5 years of drought. But I mean, one of the questions is whether what really kicks the mindset into a different mode is when you have a cascading series of crises, that one building on top of another. I mean, I remember when Katrina happened, the question was, okay, for most people in the United States, there wasn't any kind of direct effect. There were people moving out of the city. There was, of course, the catastrophic effects in that locality, and perhaps it was even regional, the whole Gulf Coast area. But I remember one commenter asking the question, how many more events of that magnitude, or maybe even somewhat smaller, at the same time would have caused really massive set of cascading effects? And that's the question I think we're going to perhaps be looking at, sort of crises building on top of each other that then create a tipping point of some kind.
So it's actually quite interesting, because we've looked in the bank at what's happened with disaster management.
Yeah.
And this is broader. A lot of it's climate related.
Mm-hmm.
And over the last 10 years, we have seen almost a geometric progression in the number of disasters which have significant economic consequences, whether it's forest fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, freezing, all of which are climate related. You throw on top of that a few earthquakes, and but those, at least at this stage, we don't think those are climate related. But
and I think you superimpose on that the inevitable issue of population.
Exactly.
There are just more people in the way of
stuff that
probabilistic
happens.
bad events.
Yep.
So, if you have lots of people living on the coast and more people living on the coast, when that Category 4 or 5 hurricane happens, there's going to be a lot of damage.
And a lot more built landscape or built environment to then have to rebuild.
But I think the rather depressing answer to your question is that no, we don't think there is a lot of long-range planning going into trying to deal with
Well, in
this.
fact, you have, the political imperative is such that we have a president after Katrina who says, we're going to build New Orleans better than ever, and replace the New Orleans that was there. Not a whole lot of thought to, maybe we should move our infrastructure inland, maybe we should think about New Orleans as being a bit more like Venice than really a stable place that's on land and so forth. So,
one of my great scholarly heroes is Mike Davis, who's written about Southern California and LA, kind of combination of urban and environmental and political history. And one of my favorite pieces used in classroom setting is an article entitled "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn." And his point is that people knew Malibu burned, and the chaparral landscape there naturally, when they first arrived there and said, wow, this is pretty. But it hasn't stopped anyone from building there. And his point is that there are huge amounts of insurance incentives and governmental political incentives for rebuilding in those areas repeatedly. Very wealthy people live there.
right. And so ironically, in terms of adaptation resilience, the behavior of those who may who may survive, ultimately prove resilient, may continue to engage in actually very problematic decision making,
And the burdens
but they're
rest on
rich
many
enough
other
to
people.
do it.
Yeah, but the burdens do extend to the rest of us as well.
And conversely, often people are too poor not to go back to that floodplain, even though it's going to flood over and over again.
Well, we're very nearly to
This
our
is
time.
actually a good
Roger?
moment to, I'm not gonna try to wrap up, in part because there are lots of interesting things that are still to be talked about, but we've got to save a little bit of firepower. There's a couple of things. First of all, a survey has come around. We do appreciate you filling that in. This will allow us to track you and track your movements and get in touch with you and so on. Second thing, there is a second act In the afternoon at 2 o'clock in the same place, we'll have presentations by three who are now in the audience: Jimin Lee from Valparaiso University, Sergei Zhuk from Ball State University, and Andrew Buck, from University of Southern Indiana, about pedagogical challenges related to these issues. Our panelists will be back with us, and I hope that many of you will be here as well. That'll be from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock.